The happiest day of my marriage was the day my wife stopped loving me. I used to think the happiest day of my marriage was the day I married my wife. I was wrong. It happened 12 years later, on a rainy Thursday, the day she stopped loving me. At least, that's what I believed. Looking back now, I understand why everyone tells you marriage changes people. What no one tells you is that sometimes it changes them so slowly that you don't notice until one ordinary morning feels completely different. When Emily and I first met, she loved everything about me. At least that's what she said. She loved how I laughed too loudly in restaurants. She loved that I never planned anything. She loved that I could spend an entire Saturday fixing an old guitar instead of doing something productive. She called me unpredictable. She said I made life exciting. For the first year, I believed I had found someone who loved me exactly as I was. Then little comments started appearing. Nothing cruel, nothing anyone else would have noticed. You'd look so much better if you wore shirts that actually fit. You know, you could probably get promoted if you were a little more ambitious. I wish you'd stop saying whatever all the time. You always leave projects half finished. I think you have so much potential. That last sentence became her favorite. I know you can be better. At first, it sounded like encouragement. Who doesn't want a partner who believes in them? So I started changing. I bought new clothes, started waking up earlier, read books she recommended, applied for a better position at work, stopped spending entire weekends in the garage restoring old guitars because, according to Emily, I was wasting my talent. Every time I changed one thing, there was another, not because she was impossible to please, because she genuinely believed she was helping me become the best version of myself. At least, that's what we both believed. Our arguments were never explosive. Emily didn't scream. She didn't throw things. She didn't insult me. She was much more dangerous than that. She stayed calm, always. I'd spend 10 minutes explaining why I made a decision. She'd listen patiently, smile, then say, "I understand why you think that." And somehow, I already knew the word "but" was coming. "But have you considered, but wouldn't it make more sense? But don't you think?" She could dismantle my confidence without ever raising her voice. The worst part? Half the time, she was right. Or at least, right enough to make me doubt myself. After every disagreement, I walked away wondering if maybe I really wasn't trying hard enough. Maybe I could communicate better. Maybe I should work harder. Maybe I should become a little more organized. Maybe she just saw a better version of me that I couldn't see myself. So I kept chasing that version, year after year, without realizing something strange. The finish line kept moving. When I got promoted, she celebrated, then started talking about management positions. When I lost 20 pounds, she told me how proud she was, then suggested I should start lifting weights. When I finally finished restoring the old Mustang I'd dreamed about since I was 22, she hugged me, then asked what my next project would be. Nothing was ever enough to stop the conversation about becoming better, and I never asked why, because I thought, that's what love looked like. Someone who always believed you could become more. Then came that Thursday. There wasn't a fight. There wasn't a dramatic conversation. Nothing happened. At least, nothing I noticed. I came home expecting Emily to remind me, again, that I'd forgotten to schedule the plumber. Instead, she kissed me, asked how my day had been. We ate dinner, watched a movie, went to bed. The plumber was never mentioned. The next morning, I realized she'd forgotten too. Or maybe she hadn't forgotten. Maybe she'd simply decided not to say anything. I didn't know it then, but that tiny silence was the beginning of everything. She stopped reminding me about things, not all at once. It happened so gradually that I couldn't even tell you when it started. She no longer pointed out the dishes I forgot in the sink. She didn't mention the towel I left on the bathroom floor. If I forgot to lock the back door, she'd simply lock it herself. No sigh, no lecture, no, "Mike, we've talked about this." Just silence. At first, I thought she'd finally accepted that nobody's perfect. Then she stopped correcting other things. One Saturday morning, I spent almost 3 hours trying to install floating shelves in our living room. When I stepped back, one of them was noticeably crooked. Emily walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee. She looked at the wall, looked at me, smiled. "They look nice." That was it. No measuring tape, no tiny tilt of her head. "No, I think the left one is a little off." I actually grabbed the level myself. She was right. It was crooked. "You're not going to say anything?" I asked. She shrugged. "If it doesn't bother you, it doesn't bother me." That answer stayed with me all day, because it wasn't Emily. The woman I married would have noticed before I even finished hanging the first shelf. She would have helped me fix it, or at least convinced me to. Instead, she walked away. A few weeks later, I forgot our grocery list at home. Normally, she'd tease me for relying on paper instead of using my phone. Instead, she laughed. I guess we'll just remember what we can. When we got home, we'd forgotten half the things we needed. She laughed again. It's just groceries. Just groceries. I couldn't remember the last time she'd said just about anything. One evening, I burned dinner. Completely ruined it. The smoke alarm went off. The kitchen smelled like charcoal. I looked at her and said, "I'm sorry." She opened the freezer, pulled out a frozen pizza, and smiled. I've been craving pizza anyway. I stared at her, waiting for the sentence that always came after. The sentence that explained how I could have avoided it, how I should have paid more attention, how next time I needed to, but it never came. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't sleep. Something was wrong. Not with us. With her. People don't just change overnight. Not after 12 years. I started paying attention. Really paying attention. She no longer asked where I was every hour. If I said I was meeting coworkers after work, she simply said, "Have fun." If I came home 40 minutes later than expected, she didn't even look at the clock. One Friday, my phone died during the day. By the time I got home, it had been almost 6 hours since we'd spoken. Years earlier, she would have called every hospital in the city. This time, she was reading a book on the couch. "Oh," she said when I walked in, "you're home." That was all. No relief, no questions, no irritation, no, "Why didn't you charge your phone?" I smiled, pretended everything was normal, but inside, I felt something I hadn't expected. Fear. Real fear. Not because we were fighting, because we weren't. The silence between us no longer felt peaceful. It felt finished. Like she'd stopped expecting anything from me. Like she'd stopped believing I could disappoint her. And for some reason, that hurt more than every argument we'd ever had. I didn't tell anyone, not at first, because how do you explain that your marriage feels like it's ending? Simply because your wife has become too kind. Eventually, I mentioned it to my best friend, Daniel. We were watching a baseball game when I finally said, "I think Emily doesn't love me anymore." He nearly choked on his beer. "What? She doesn't get mad." He laughed. "I wish Lisa would stop getting mad. I'm serious." He looked at me for a long moment, then shrugged. "Maybe she's just happier." I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to. But happiness wasn't what I saw. What I saw was a woman who had stopped trying, and somewhere deep inside me, I became convinced that people only stop trying when they've already started letting go. I became obsessed, not with saving my marriage, with proving to myself that I wasn't imagining it. People don't wake up one day and become completely different. There had to be a reason, so I started testing her, not intentionally. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. One Saturday, I left my coffee mug on the kitchen counter. Emily hated that. She always said, if it makes it to the sink, it takes 2 more seconds to put it in the dishwasher. I left it there all day. She walked past it 3 times. She picked it up that evening, washed it, put it away. She never mentioned it. The next week, I forgot to take the trash out. Trash day had always been my responsibility. By lunchtime, I realized I'd forgotten. I rushed outside. The bins were already empty. Emily had taken them to the curb before leaving for work. When she came home, I apologized. "I'm sorry. I completely forgot." She smiled. I figured. That was it. No disappointment. No, you always forget. Just, I figured. For some reason, that sentence hurt. It sounded like she'd stopped expecting me to remember. Stopped expecting me to change. Stopped expecting anything. A month later, I made a mistake at work. A big one. One of my reports had the wrong numbers. The client noticed before I did. I came home furious with myself. Emily listened while I vented. I was waiting for her to ask why I hadn't double-checked everything. She always encouraged me to be more careful. Instead, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You'll fix it," I laughed bitterly. "I always make stupid mistakes." She looked me straight in the eyes. "No, you make human mistakes." I don't know why those words unsettled me. Maybe because they sounded final, like she wasn't trying to help me become better anymore. She was simply accepting who I already was. At the time, acceptance felt strangely similar to giving up. I started trying harder, much harder. Flowers, random dates, weekend trips. I even rebuilt the old guitar I'd abandoned years earlier because she'd once said it wasn't a good use of my time. This time, she sat beside me in the garage for hours. She handed me tools, asked questions, smiled whenever I explained how something worked. When I finished, she clapped like I'd just won an award. You should play it more. I stared at her. You used to hate when I spent time in here. She frowned. Did I? I laughed. You called it my cave. She was quiet for a second. Then she nodded slowly. I guess I did. There was something strange in the way she said it. Not defensive, not embarrassed, almost sad. Weeks passed, then months. Our marriage looked perfect from the outside. We barely argued anymore. Friends joked that we'd figured out the secret. One night, Daniel raised a glass at dinner. To Mike and Emily, the only married couple I know who never fight. Everyone laughed. Emily smiled politely. I forced a smile too, because only I knew the truth. We didn't stop fighting because we'd solved our problems. We stopped fighting because only one of us was still fighting. Driving home that night, I finally asked the question that had been haunting me for months. Emily. She looked over from the passenger seat. Yeah? Are you still happy? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she watched the rain sliding down the window. Finally, she said, I've never been happier. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But something inside me whispered, people who are happy don't change this much. So I asked the question I'd been avoiding. Do you still love me? She turned toward me, without hesitation, without confusion, without even thinking. Yes. Just one word. Yes. No long explanation, no passionate speech, no reassurance, just yes. For reasons I couldn't explain, that single word scared me more than if she'd said nothing at all. About 3 months later, I made the biggest mistake of our marriage. I stopped trying to understand Emily and started trying to win her back. Not because she'd asked me to, because I was convinced I'd already lost her. I bought flowers, not on anniversaries, random Tuesdays, the kind she always said she loved. Sunflowers. She smiled, put them in a vase, kissed me on the cheek, but something felt different. Years ago, she would have wrapped her arms around me and said, what did I do to deserve these? Now she simply smiled. Thank you. It sounded genuine, but it didn't sound like relief or excitement, just gratitude. A few weeks later, I surprised her with tickets to the cabin where we'd spend our honeymoon. I spent hours planning everything. I booked the same room, the same restaurant, even found the same hiking trail we'd gotten lost on 12 years earlier. She seemed excited. We laughed. We ate too much. We stayed up talking until 2 in the morning. Anyone watching us would have said, they're in love. Maybe we were, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something invisible had disappeared. On our last night there, I finally asked, do you ever miss us? Emily frowned. What do you mean? I looked down at my hands. The way we used to be. She was quiet. I don't think about it much. That answer hit me harder than I expected. Not because it was cruel, because it wasn't. It was honest. She didn't even think about it. The drive home was almost silent. For the first time in 12 years, I wondered what life would look like after divorce. Not because she'd mentioned it. Because I couldn't imagine any other explanation. People don't stop fighting unless they've stopped caring, right? A few days later, I called Daniel. I think it's over. What happened? Nothing, he laughed. Mike, that's a good thing. No, I shook my head even though he couldn't see me. You don't understand. She doesn't complain. So, she doesn't expect anything anymore. He was quiet. Then he asked, have you ever considered that maybe she's finally accepted you? I almost laughed. No one just accepts someone. Marriage doesn't work like that. Daniel didn't answer for a few seconds. Then he said something I wouldn't understand until much later. Maybe that's exactly how it works. I dismissed it immediately. Because in my mind, love was effort, correction, growth, trying. If someone stopped trying, they'd stopped loving. I was so certain of that I never stopped to ask myself a different question. What if I had been wrong about love from the very beginning? About 2 weeks later, I accidentally found something I wasn't supposed to see. Emily had left her notebook on the dining room table. She'd been carrying it everywhere for months. Sometimes she'd write in it while drinking coffee, sometimes before bed. Whenever I asked what it was, she'd smile. Just thoughts. I never pushed. Everyone deserves a little privacy. That afternoon, I wasn't trying to snoop. I was looking for a warranty receipt we'd left inside one of the drawers. The notebook slid off the pile and hit the floor. It opened. I should have closed it. I know that. Instead, my eyes landed on a sentence. Stop trying to change him. I froze. There were dozens of pages, each one dated. Each one filled with short notes. Almost like reminders. I told myself I was only going to read one page, then I'd close it. The first entry read, Today, Mike forgot to call the electrician again. Underneath it, don't say anything. Another page. He left his coffee mug on the counter. Leave it. Another. He's excited about the guitar again. Don't ruin it. Another. He isn't broken. I couldn't breathe. At first, I thought she was writing instructions for herself because she'd already given up, like someone taking care of a patient they no longer believed could recover. I kept reading. He doesn't need another teacher. He needs a wife. I closed the notebook immediately. My hands were shaking. Emily walked into the kitchen a minute later. She saw the notebook, saw my face, and instantly knew. You read it. It wasn't a question. I nodded. I'm sorry. She sat down across from me. Neither of us spoke for almost a full minute. Finally, I whispered, So, you really did stop trying. She looked at me for a long time, long enough that I started preparing myself for the answer I'd feared for months. Then she quietly said, Yes. That single word shattered something inside me. I looked away before she could see the tears. I knew it. I knew you stopped loving me. She didn't argue. She didn't interrupt. She didn't even try to defend herself. She simply reached across the table and took my hand. Then she said the one sentence that would force me to question everything I thought I knew about our marriage. Mike, that's not what I stopped doing. She kept holding my hand. I couldn't even look at her. For months, I'd been preparing myself for this moment. The moment she'd finally admit it, that she'd fallen out of love, that she'd stayed because leaving would have been harder. Instead, she looked at me with tears in her eyes. Mike, I didn't stop loving you. I let out a quiet laugh. You literally just said you stopped trying. I did. Then what's the difference? She took a deep breath. A huge one. I pulled my hand away. I don't understand. I know. She looked down at the notebook between us. You only read a few pages. I nodded. I couldn't keep reading. She slowly opened it, flipped back to the very first page. It was dated almost a year earlier. She turned it toward me. At the top, in large letters, were 5 words. Things I need to unlearn. I frowned. What is this? She smiled sadly. My therapist told me to write them down. I looked at her. You've been seeing a therapist? For almost a year. I couldn't remember her mentioning it. Then again, she had. She'd said she was meeting a friend after work every Wednesday. I'd never asked which friend. I looked back at the page. The first sentence read, Love isn't fixing people. The second, if he changes because he's afraid of disappointing me, that's not love. My chest tightened. Emily quietly said, I wrote those after one of our sessions. I turned another page. Another reminder. Stop correcting every little thing. Another. Perfection is not intimacy. Another. Ask yourself one question before speaking. Am I helping him, or am I trying to control the outcome? I looked up. You thought you were controlling me. She closed her eyes for a moment. I thought I was helping you. She swallowed hard. My dad used to say something when I was growing up. If you really love someone, you never let them settle. So every time I saw something you could improve, I believed it was my responsibility to point it out. She laughed quietly. I honestly thought that's what a good wife was supposed to do. I remembered every conversation we'd ever had, every suggestion, every correction, every, you could do better. She wasn't trying to hurt me. She genuinely believed she was loving me. Emily looked at me. Do you remember the guitar? I nodded. You stopped playing because of me. I opened my mouth to disagree, then stopped, because she was right. I told myself I was encouraging you to focus on your career. She looked down, but all I really taught you was that the things you loved needed my approval. The room fell silent. For the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about divorce. I was thinking about every version of myself I'd quietly abandoned. The garage, the old guitar, the weekend projects, the lazy Saturdays, the ridiculous road trips with no destination, the man she met, without realizing it. I'd spent years becoming someone I thought she'd love more, and she'd spent years believing that was exactly what love required. Then Emily whispered something so quietly I almost missed it. I woke up one morning and realized I couldn't remember the last time you did something just because it made you happy. She looked at me, tears running down her face, and that's when I knew. I hadn't been building a better husband. I'd been slowly erasing the man I fell in love with. I didn't say anything. What could I possibly say? For nearly a year, I'd convinced myself my marriage was ending, and in the span of 20 minutes, Emily had turned everything I believed upside down. That night, neither of us slept much, not because we were fighting, because we were thinking. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. Emily was still asleep. For the first time in years, I walked into the garage. The old guitar was hanging exactly where I'd left it. I hadn't touched it in months, maybe longer. I picked it up, ran my hand across the strings. They were slightly out of tune, just like me. I laughed quietly at the thought. Then I remembered something. 6 years earlier, I'd been sitting in this exact chair, trying to finish restoring it. Emily had walked in. She watched me for a minute before saying, "You've already spent 3 weekends on that thing. I just think your time could be used for something bigger." At the time, I smiled, put the guitar away, and never finished it. Back then, I told myself it didn't matter. It was just a hobby. Now, I realized it had never been about the guitar. It was about what happened every time I loved something that didn't fit into someone else's definition of success. I slowly looked around the garage, the old fishing rods, covered in dust, the camera I'd once taken everywhere, still inside its case, a half-finished model airplane I'd promised myself I'd build with my nephew. Every unfinished project told the same story. None of them ended because I stopped caring. They ended because I slowly convinced myself they weren't important enough. Then another memory surfaced, the crooked shelf. For months I'd believed Emily hadn't noticed it. I walked into the living room, stared at it. It was still crooked, barely, maybe half an inch. I smiled. Of course she'd noticed. Emily noticed everything. She'd probably seen it before I even stepped off the ladder. The difference wasn't that she'd stopped seeing flaws. She'd stopped believing every flaw needed to be fixed. I suddenly remembered the burned pizza, the forgotten trash, the plumber, the grocery list. Every single moment I'd mistaken for indifference had actually been restraint. She had noticed. She had simply chosen peace over perfection. I stood there staring at that shelf when I heard footsteps behind me. Emily was awake. She leaned against the doorway. Neither of us spoke. Finally, she smiled. "You noticed it? The shelf?" I nodded. "It's been crooked this whole time." She laughed softly. "I know. You knew. The day you put it up." I couldn't help smiling. "Why didn't you tell me?" She walked over, rested her hand on my arm. "Because I finally realized I'd rather live in a house with crooked shelves than in one where the man I love feels like he's constantly being graded." Those words hit harder than anything she'd said the night before. I looked around our home. Nothing had changed. The shelf was still crooked. The kitchen floor still squeaked near the window. One cabinet door never closed all the way. Tiny imperfections, things I'd spent years trying to fix, things she'd spent years pointing out, things that suddenly didn't seem important anymore. Emily looked at me and smiled. "You know what's funny?" "What?" "I used to think I was protecting our marriage by correcting every little thing." She looked around the room. "But all I was really doing was teaching us to notice everything that was wrong." She took my hand, and I almost forgot to notice everything that was already right. For the next few weeks, nothing extraordinary happened. We didn't renew our vows. We didn't take a romantic vacation. We didn't suddenly become the perfect couple. Life simply kept going. But somehow, everything felt different. One Saturday morning, I walked into the kitchen and accidentally dropped an entire carton of eggs. They exploded across the floor. A year earlier, I would have started apologizing before the first shell even stopped rolling. Instead, I looked at Emily. She looked at the mess, then back at me. We both started laughing, real laughter, the kind we hadn't shared in years. Later that afternoon, I finally straightened the shelf in the living room, not because Emily wanted me to, because I wanted to. It took less than 5 minutes. When I stepped back, I smiled proudly. Emily walked in. She looked at it. "It's straight." I nodded. "What do you think?" She walked over, wrapped her arms around my waist, rested her head against my shoulder. I'm glad you did it because it made you happy. Not because it made the room perfect." Months passed. Slowly, pieces of the old me started returning. The guitar came back into the garage. Fishing trips came back. Lazy Sunday mornings came back. Sometimes I wasted an entire afternoon doing absolutely nothing. Emily never once asked whether it was productive. Instead, she'd bring me a cup of coffee, sit beside me, and ask me to play another song. One evening, while cleaning out the garage together, I found her notebook again. This time, I asked permission before opening it. She smiled. "Go ahead." Most of the pages were filled with reminders, questions, things she'd written after therapy. Then I reached the final page. Unlike the others, it wasn't a reminder. It was a journal entry. It had been written the day before she'd stopped correcting me. It read, "Today I realized something that broke my heart. Mike apologizes for being himself. He apologizes when he's excited. He apologizes when he's excited. He apologizes before I even tell him I've noticed anything. Then there was one final sentence, the shortest one in the entire notebook. I don't want a better husband. I want mine back. I stared at those words for a long time, long enough that the letters began to blur. Emily quietly took the notebook from my hands. I'm sorry, she whispered. I shook my head. No. For years, I thought love meant earning someone's approval, becoming a little smarter, a little stronger, a little more successful, a little closer to perfect. I never realized how exhausting it is to spend every day trying to become someone else. Emily stepped closer. I loved you the day we met. I just forgot that loving someone isn't the same as improving them. I smiled. And I forgot that changing for someone isn't always the same as growing. She reached for my hand, just like she had the day we met. Except this time, neither of us was trying to change the other. We were simply standing there, exactly as we were. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt like enough. People still ask me what saved our marriage. They expect me to talk about therapy, communication, forgiveness. They're all part of the answer, but they aren't the whole answer. The truth is, the happiest day of my marriage wasn't the day my wife stopped loving me. It was the day she stopped loving the man she thought I should become, and remembered the man she'd fallen in love with all those years ago. And maybe that was the day I stopped trying to become someone else too. Because in the end, the strongest marriages aren't built by two people constantly trying to fix each other. They're built by two people who wake up every morning, look at the imperfect person standing in front of them, and quietly decide, you're enough.